Hello, everyone, and welcome to class. We're looking at chapters 1 and 2 in this lecture. I'm your instructor for this course. My name is Dr. Jason Brummett. My primary professional practice is in physical therapy, although I hold certifications as an athletic trainer and as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. My primary position is as an associate professor of physical therapy at George Fox University. George Fox University is a private institution located in Newberg, Oregon, which is about 30 minutes or so west of the Portland, Oregon area. I also do clinical work. I have a few different per diem or part-time positions. Part-time position, I work for ATI, which has about 900 orthopedic clinics across the United States, and I work for one in the Clackamas, Oregon area. I also do some per diem work for Concentra, which does work comp physical therapy. So people that get injured on the job, they go to the urgent care. The urgent care physician refers them in-house in the Concentra facility for physical therapy. So the goal is to get them seen quickly and to try to get them back to work as quickly as possible. And then I also do some skilled nursing work for a group known as Consonas. Research. I like doing things with sports epidemiology. So in the past, I've done a lot of work looking at measures of preseason fitness using functional performance tests and looking to see if those can predict future injury. I've also started doing blood flow restriction training and looking at how blood flow restriction training can potentially increase strength within our patient populations. Future interests include merging health and wellness into physical therapy practice. So I'm doing some additional coursework myself, studying things like health coaching and functional nutrition. And I've recently become a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and looking forward to going to their first conference, or not their first conference, my first conference, their annual conference, which is in Denver this year, and learning more about that. So this first section here, we're looking at chapters 1 and chapter 2 in your textbook. And chapter 1 is the history of treatment toward persons with disability in America. Early attitudes and treatment towards persons with disabilities were blatantly prejudiced and discriminatory. Issue of disability became pressing in the United States around 1838 at a time that there was a large influx of immigrants to the United States. And of course, as we know throughout US history, immigration has been looked down upon. And it doesn't matter if it is looking down upon immigrants from south of our border or how the Irish, for example, were looked down upon at one time coming to the United States. If any group is quote unquote new to the United States, unfortunately, there has been many people who have been against that. So anti-disability legislation started in the 1800s, continued through the early 1900s, and the purpose of the early laws were to prevent immigration of people who were considered undesirable. And what's interesting is you can look to the literature and see that researchers are trying to study immigration, experiences of immigrants going obviously to new countries, and what those experiences are of individuals with disabilities. Here was the first one that popped up when I was doing a search. It was something based out of Norway, and the date on that 2020, so pretty recent. Now, communicable diseases can be potentially viewed as a handicap or disability. So in the United States, The American with Disabilities Act incorporates and expands existing protections provided in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. In cases decided under this predecessor act, the U.S. Supreme Court held that a person with a communicable disease, tuberculosis in this case, was handicapped under the definition of the law. This case involved a school teacher with a history of recurrent activation of her tuberculosis who was fired after becoming sputum positive. While acknowledging that Arline was covered under provisions of the act, the court was left with a question of whether she was otherwise qualified to be a teacher. So it is an active, with the law is a live thing, a living thing. People try to create laws and then they're interpreted, obviously, and interpretations here find that in this case, a communicable disease can potentially be a disability. So why are we, or what am I trying to get through to you here? Well, again, if we look to the past, individuals with disabilities have been looked down upon. And even in the current time, it is potentially looked down upon too. Think about things politically, how some individuals, some groups will be anti-immigration, and one of the things that they will cite or suggest is that immigrants potentially bring communicable diseases or infectious diseases. Of course, this is a debated topic, and you'll have individuals on both sides making suggestions that a reason to reduce immigration could be because individuals who bring communicable diseases, disabilities in general, may put an excessive strain upon our healthcare system. Again, that is a debate, sometimes grounded in arguably rational economic reasons. Other times it's grounded in fear, racism, and xenophobia. And it's always, not just necessarily an issue of how individuals that may be from Central America, the racism side potentially that we see within the United States, there can be controversies or hatred even expressed to those born in the United States, but born with a disability such as dwarfism. Dwarfism is recognized as a protected disability status, and individuals with dwarfism have been, there's been bias against them. There's been, at times, fear, prejudice. And if you've paid attention to the news within the past year or so, at least the entertainment news, you might know that there is a new live-action Snow White movie being made. And Peter Dinklage, a well-known actor, those of you may know him from the Game of Thrones series. I think that's probably his most well-known work, among other things. He was quoted on a podcast, and he was discussing Snow White, saying not to get too political about it, but it's a stereotype that still exists. Stereotype regarding dwarfism and the seven dwarfs. He noted dwarf tossing still exists. There are still people of my size dressing up as elves at Christmas time. And if everybody continues to do that, then it won't stop. But my daughter doesn't think I'm a mythical creature. Unicorns don't exist, but I do. It's tricky what we put out there to perpetuate for future generations. And so I think he was making comments about how he'd like to see the quote-unquote seven dwarves represented in Snow White. I think he was wanting to see them not represented as a caricature, but more so as kind of complicated characters, individuals with stories, individuals that were human and not just representing that caricature of being a dwarf. Now, that's led to controversy. And of course, unfortunately, in the United States, you can't say, hey, it's a beautiful blue sky today without somebody saying, no, you're wrong, it's green. There are people that are complaining about a fairy tale movie. They're complaining that Disney is not using the quote unquote seven dwarves anymore. And people are complaining about Peter Dinklage and misconstruing his remarks and what he was suggesting as a potentially positive role change for the characters. And again, it's a made up story. Who cares? Why are people getting so worked up? What I'm trying to get across is people hold views of other individuals. And unfortunately, even though in the past there were more maybe openly expressed, even laws against the disabled, against those who were different, many people still hold on to that. And many people look to make a political argument and don't want to let go of their view of the world, of their stereotypes, of their biases. And again, there's lots of information about this current brouhaha online. Again, my whole point to get across is that we're looking at, in these situations, dwarfism as a recognized disability. People still hold views about dwarfism, biases towards people with dwarfism, prejudices towards them. You look at immigrants, people want to restrict immigration of individuals, some who might have disabilities, some who may have diseases that they fear. And so, again, long story short, again, in the United States, we've seen an evolution, an improvement in our laws, but we haven't necessarily seen an improvement or a changing in all of our hearts. So, what's discrimination? Well, I think we all are aware of that or recognize that many people with disabilities were discriminated against. And again, they were discriminated because of biases, prejudices, and erroneous perceptions. Another topic brought up in Chapter 1 is eugenics. Eugenics, it is a social philosophy advocating the improvement of human genetic traits through the promotion of higher rates of sexual reproduction for people with desired traits, that being known as positive eugenics, or reduced rates of sexual reproduction and sterilization of people with less desired or undesired traits, that being negative eugenics. Galton in 1883 believed that natural selection could rid mankind of problems such as disease, criminality, alcoholism, and poverty. Eugenics reached America in 1900. Many prominent people agreed with this idea. Question, though, is who are the undesirable? And that's always really the important question is, when somebody is in power and they decide that somebody is undesirable, usually it is somebody that doesn't look like them or act like them or believe like them. There was passage of sterilization laws in the early 20th century. A goal was to improve the quality of the nation's citizenry by reducing the birth rate of individuals they considered to be feeble-minded. Feeble-minded is a term used to describe anyone with any type of observed or perceived mental or physical disability. Indiana was the first state to implement eugenic sterilization laws in 1907. The city of Chicago had an ordinance in 1881. It was the Ugly Laws. These ugly laws targeted unsightly beggars. So, in 1881, this municipal ordinance fined any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object for appearing in public, within the context of late 19th century imagings of what was considered disability. Helpful legislation was initiated in the 20s and 30s and continued on into the 90s with the Americans with Disabilities Act. These are some of the laws that were passed to help move towards equality and have a positive impact upon the lives of those with disabilities. So things have improved since the last century, or I should say the century before that even, because the last century was the 1900s, obviously, and a lot of these things go back to the 1800s. Are there people that still hold on to these views and beliefs? And I think I made that argument with some of my examples earlier. And what type of language is occurring in our socio-political discourse? How are people talked about? What groups are marginalized? Sometimes they are people directly with disabilities. Other times there are directed towards people of other races, ethnicities, nationalities, sexualities, and so forth, or gender even. Now, eugenics as a term has been replaced by the term designer babies. I don't think I've seen anything in the news recently looking at genetic changes or genetic, I haven't seen that as popular of a thing of like, hey, get the genetic child you want. But who knows, as technology improves, will that be something that rears its head again? Let's look at chapter 2 now. Chapter 2 on the origins of negative attitudes toward people with disabilities. So, where do our attitudes about individuals with disabilities come from? One area is sociocultural conditioning. Pervasive social and cultural norms, standards, and expectations often lead to the creation of negative attitudes toward the disabled population. So, some contributing factors. First, emphasis on concepts such as body beautiful, body whole, youth, health, athletic prowess, things like that. An emphasis on personal productiveness and achievement. Individuals in most Western countries are judged on the basis of their ability to be socially and economically competitive. The prevailing socioeconomic level of an individual. Society's delineation of the sick role phenomena. So, with the sick role phenomena, we will tolerate as a society some level of sickness or injury or time off from social obligations, but the length of time a disabled person remains in this role is associated with negative attitudes. Think about some healthcare providers you might know and their views towards people with a chronic musculoskeletal condition. And do they hold views of that individual as positive or negative? What is their view towards somebody that has an acute episode of back pain versus somebody who has a 4-year history of back pain and is unable to work? The cultural values, and the last one here is the status of degradation attached to disability. So the cultural values held by members of society are often based on the perception of any form of imputed deviancy, including disability, as a sign of marginal status. The person with a disability is viewed as an outsider, an offender, or as different. Where do attitudes come from? Again, childhood influences, psychodynamic mechanisms, disability as a punishment for sin, anxiety-provoking unstructured situations, aesthetic aversion, threats to body image integrity, comparisons to minority groups, disability as a reminder of death, and prejudice-inviting behaviors. So the first one there, childhood influences, I think makes sense because if we think about what our parents say, what our family members say, what those around of us say, and before we are able to think for ourselves, or even when we should be able to think for ourselves, sometimes those influences will color how we look at others. Psychodynamic mechanisms. Several mainly unconscious psychological processes have been advanced in the literature as an explanatory mechanism for the attitudes manifested by the non-disabled towards the disabled. Although most of these mechanisms are apparently shown during early childhood and may therefore be regarded as related to childhood experiences, it is felt that because of their significance in creating and maintaining these attitudes, a awareness of these psychodynamic mechanisms are warranted. And if you're interested in going into those, you can check out that section of the chapter. Disability as a punishment for sin. Some individuals, for religious purposes, will believe that their behavior has brought on a punishment from their creator, from their God, and their sickness experience is a result of not meeting the requirements of their faith. Looking at anxiety-provoking unstructured situations, the role of unfamiliar situations in creating anxiety and confusion has been stressed by researchers. So suggesting that on initial interaction with a disabled person, the non-disabled person is often faced with an unstructured situation in which most socially accepted rules and regulations for proper interaction are not well defined. These ambiguous situations tend to disrupt both the cognitive intellectual processes as well as the more fundamental perceptual affective mechanisms. So basically, when somebody is meeting with, coming across a individual with a disability for the first time, they may not know how to act. They may have a kind of a fear or not, a discomfort. Aesthetic aversion. This is what's been proposed as an aversion to the sight of a visibly disabled person. The next one, threats to body image integrity. This concept of body image as the mental representation of one's own body was coined by a researcher in 1935. Several related formulations were proposed regarding the importance of the body image concept as an explanatory vehicle in understanding the attitudes toward people with disabilities. For example, someone sees an individual with a disability and that creates a fear in someone of losing their own physical integrity. Again, several of these things have kind of psychological bases to them and don't have any type of rationale. I guess another way of saying it, it's an irrational human experience driven by somebody's psychology. Next one there, comparisons to minority groups. So this is the view that attitudes towards the disabled population parallel those manifested towards minority groups, advocated by researchers in 1953 and further elaborated on. This view holds that disabled people as a marginal group trigger negative reactions in the non-disabled majority. Being perceived as marginal or as a member of a minority group carries with it the same stereotypic reactions of occupying a devalued and inferior status shared by ethnic, racial, and religious groups. The resulting attitude can, therefore, be categorized as being discriminatory and prejudiced in nature and as advocating isolation and segregation of disabled persons from the remaining population. Disability as a reminder of death. So the parallelism between reactions toward those who are disabled and feelings associated with dying was suggested by several authors. The contention is that the loss of a body or a physical function constitutes the death of a part which in the past was integrally associated with one's ego. The anxiety associated with death is therefore rekindled at the sight of a disabled person. The disabled groups, both literally and symbolically, serve as a denial of our primitive, infantile omnipotence and as a reminder of our mortality. And also, there is the prejudice inviting behaviors. Researchers have discussed the effect of certain provocative behaviors by persons with disabilities, not provocative, provoking behaviors. And these provoking behaviors may be categorized in two ways: prejudice by invitation, specific behaviors by disabled individuals, such as being dependent, seeking secondary gains, acting fearful, insecure, or inferior, create and strengthen certain prejudicial beliefs in the observer. Prejudice by silence, so this is the lack of interest on the disabled person's part or lack of effective public relation campaigns or self-help groups representing the interests and concerns of specific disability groups to combat the public's ignorance, is a way of fostering stereotypic and negative attitudes on the latter's part. So looking at some demographics associated with attitudes, looking at sex here, and I think this is related to biological sex versus the more spectrum of gender as it's being defined now. Females display more favorable attitudes toward individuals who are physically disabled than males. Age, U-shaped, more favorable for those who are in late childhood or younger adulthood. So they have a more favorable view. Socioeconomic status, higher incomes have a more favorable view. And educational level. Educational level is associated with a more favorable attitude. And I think when I said favorable view previously, that was maybe not the best way of representing that, maybe a more favorable attitude towards individuals with disabilities. So females, those who are younger, those who have higher incomes, and those who have higher educational attainment. These are personalities associated with attitudes that have poorer attitudes towards the disabled. And I think a lot of these make sense. People that are ethnocentric have more of an authoritarian type of streak or support more of authoritarianism. Those who are aggressive have low self-insight. Those who are anxious, those who are less confident, less secure in themselves, have low body self-satisfaction. Those who have ambiguity tolerance, low social desirability, alienation, and lower intellectual levels. All right, this is the end of the first screencast for the week.